Okay, very good evening to all the attendees and our esteemed speakers, Clem, Sunter, and Mitch Ilbury. They are the authors of the new best-selling title, Thinking the Future, which was released around mid-2021. The book has since gone on to sell many, many copies. This is a great discussion. I cannot wait for it. And this will be a discussion on the book itself, as well as the topic of future thinking. I would like to thank Exclusive Books for hosting this event. The book is now widely available at Exclusive Books as well as their online store. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can type those in there, and we'll see it pop up at the bottom, and our authors will be sure to answer them for you. Without further ado, my name is Vis Chetty. I'm part of the Penguin Random House team who have published the book, and we're very proud to be involved with this book. So now I will hand you over to the authors, Mitch and Clem.
Thanks very much, Viz, and thanks to everyone who's tuned in. Clem and I are very excited to launch this book through Exclusive Books with you. And actually, we got our first sales figures today. And we're very pleased to say that we've sold almost 3,000 copies in the first 1.5 months. So it's off to a lightning start, and hopefully every single person tuning in, if you haven't bought the book already, will buy it, because Clem and I wow you into doing so. If not, please put that in the chat function, and we'll be sure to note your frustration at us. How are we going to structure it? Sometimes these kinds of events have a moderator, but Clem and I were so confident that we said we don't need a moderator. We can do our own thing and push through the various chapters in the book. So what I'll do is just kind of set the scene, what the book's about, how it came into fruition, and then slowly but surely Clem and I are going to just work through the various chapters and highlight some of the really most important part of each chapter that'll hopefully whet your appetite to go in and delve into it even further. But how the book came about actually starts off with the discussion that Clem and I had, must be about 18 months ago now, where we were discussing the work of Philip Tetlock, who released a seminal study looking at political judgment and forecasting. In a book called How Good is Political Judgment, and then later on another book called Super Forecasters. And in the seminal study that he put together, which spanned over 2 decades, he asked the question, how good is political judgment? How good are these people that get reeled out in news-based panel shows looking at predictions for the future, looking at a shoe-in for a Hillary Clinton victory, or the next pandemic, and confidently put forward their forecasts. And in that, he asked the question, well, how good are their predictions? Let's hold them accountable and analyze it in a very scientific way. So over 2 decades, he studied 82,000 forecasts and came to the conclusion that these people are as accurate as dart-throwing chimpanzees. In other words, they're completely random in terms of how accurate they are. So Clem and I were discussing this because in the book, he highlights how, through looking at these different forecasts, naturally, people who think more like foxes are more accurate forecasters. They constantly revise their assumptions in the face of new evidence. They balance multiple perspectives when weighing up a belief on a certain subject. And they're naturally, agile, adaptable thinkers. And that characteristic makes them more accurate forecasters. But there were 2 problems that Clem and I identified in that study and in what Philip Tetlock was putting together. And one is that, quite simply, foxes aren't forecasters. They're too smart for that. Rather than trying to predict a single projection of the future, they entertain multiple different scenarios and use those scenarios to inform their decision-making. But the second point of difference we had is that these so-called brilliant foxy forecasters that Philip Tetlock highlights in the book are exceptional people with exceptional backgrounds in terms of incredibly high IQs, brilliant thinkers that are leaders in their field one way or another. And we asked the question, well, where does that lead or leave the average person? Where does that leave the ordinary person who's making a decision about whether to take out a mortgage, where they should live, where they should maybe send their child to school? all of these questions are questions about the future and are critically important to their decision-making going forward. So how do we help those people be more effective futurist thinkers? And that was really the origin of this book and how it came about. And that's why the whole design behind what we've put together is trying to enable the average person, the ordinary person, a key set of principles that they can use to think the future more effectively. Clem, do you want to highlight anything there before I start off in terms of the first chapter?
Yeah, just to say that one of the most important points we make is that if you're a real fox, you play scenarios because you want to obviously end up in the good scenario and steer away from the bad scenario. So it's a much more motivational approach to looking at the future. And of course, when it comes to action, you want to change the probabilities of the good scenario for the better. And so, you know, forecasting does have its limit. And so we've really tried to contrast this book with, you know, Super Forecasting, which is the sort of #1 bestseller in the United States at the moment. And yeah, we just feel that scenario planning is much better than forecasting the future for ordinary people.
So naturally, Clem and I start the book by saying, before you start looking to the future, we need to understand how you make sense of reality, because how you make sense of reality will inform how you think it will play out. So we look at a brilliant painting by Raphael from the 16th century, where it was, he did one of the most beautiful paintings in existence. And please go and try and have a look at it, called the School of Athens. And really it's a Where's Wally of ancient Greek philosophers, where a number of them that you can identify, but really Raphael in his mastery draws attention to the two central figures in the painting, Plato and Aristotle, who are framed with the blue sky behind them. And what Raphael was trying to capture was a fundamental distinction between two ways of engaging with the world. One, thinking like Plato, is to think of or to have a single theory that you use to interpret the different ways in which you understand the world around you. You use that theory to inform how you think things will play out. On the other hand, Aristotle, who has his hand pointing down towards the ground, says, no, we can't imagine some, one single overarching theory that sums up everything that we understand about our world. Rather, we need to take our cue from reality and piece together the different bits of evidence that we have before us and try and create a holistic picture. And, one way to think about it is to think about how you might engage with the puzzle. Traditionally, when you get a puzzle, on the front cover is the diagram or the image that you're trying to recreate. And so you have a reference point to try and piece the different puzzle pieces together. But Aristotle says, well, hold on, in life, we don't have access to a puzzle box cover. We're not sure of the blueprint in terms of how each piece must fit together. So how then do we engage with all of these different puzzle pieces? So if you think about the way you might engage with it, you look at the different flat edge pieces and you start with those on the outside and create an outer perimeter. Then you might group the different colors together because you think those go together. Through following some rational principles, you can start to piece together a coherent picture that matches something of what is on the puzzle box cover. And this is a fundamental distinction between how we engage with the world and therefore how we think it's going to play out. And Isaiah Berlin, who was a philosopher in the 1950s and 60s based out of Oxford, used this distinction to look back at some of history's greatest thinkers and said some of them are hedgehogs. They use one theory to encapsulate their understanding of the world and therefore how they think it's going to play out. And foxes, who are much more comfortable in complexity, much more comfortable in uncertainty, and rather balance different perspectives, constantly revise their assumptions in the face of new evidence, and try to build a picture of the world in that sense. And so Clem and I launch off the book with this distinction of the fox and the hedgehog, which obviously has a long history in terms of his work with Chantal Ilbury, which stretches back over 20 years and predates some of the other foxy thinkers that you might have heard of, like Philip Tetlock, like Jim Collins in his Good to Great book. And really that sets the scene for what is to follow.
I'll just add one point, Mitch, which is that each chapter we have giants of the past who we describe, who we think that their theories, like Plato and Aristotle and Isaiah Berlin, are very relevant in terms of shaping the way you look at the future. So the subtitle is New Perspectives from the Shoulders of Giants.
So after we've set the scene and looked at, different ways of engaging with the world and therefore how you think it's going to play out, we then go right back to the roots, quite literally to the foundations of how you engage with the world, to say, who are some of the giants that we can emulate to really be more effective futures thinkers. And as I said, we go back to the foundations and really to the master himself, Socrates, who was an ancient Greek philosopher and considered the kind of father of philosophy in many ways, and set the scene for what is our kind of modern day interpretation of loving wisdom, which is what philosophy means. And there's this brilliant story that we touch on in the book, which is a famous story in philosophy circles, but perhaps not wider than those circles, of how Socrates came to eventually drink hemlock and kill himself under the order of the Athenian public. And the story goes that a good friend of his, Chaerephon, considering the fame and infamy of Socrates around ancient Athens for being one of the wisest people around, said, well, hold on, I'm actually going to go to the Oracle of Delphi, who's this famous oracle who can, foretell the future, backed by the god Apollo, the god of prophecy. And I'm going to go and ask this oracle, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? So he made the journey up to Delphi, which was considered the center of the world at that time, and asked the oracle, said, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? And the oracle came back with an emphatic no. There's no one wiser than Socrates. So when Chaerephon brought this news back to Socrates, he was dumbfounded. He didn't quite understand, because he thought that he knew nothing. And therefore, there was no way that he could be the wisest man around. And so he went around ancient Athens asking people a series of questions about what they do in terms of what is justice, in terms of how you structure a political state. And at first, while they seemed to offer convincing answers, under a little bit of scrutiny, they seemed to not actually know what they were talking about, and their beliefs were full of logical fallacies. And so he came to the conclusion, well, hold on, maybe what the oracle was trying to point at is that my ignorance, my awareness of my own ignorance, my awareness of my own limits to my knowledge is what is the definition of wisdom. That is an understanding of not portraying that you know something when you don't, but being aware of just how much you don't know. And that's what made him the ultimate questioner, and actually got on a lot of people's nerves, because he went around ancient Athens asking all of these very difficult questions about fundamental things about how we live our lives. And that principle of asking questions to try and root out the frail foundations to our knowledge is critically important. Otherwise, we start building these Jenga blocks, this edifice of knowledge, on these flawed foundations. So really, we need to embrace the Socratic approach, question the assumptions that underpin our beliefs, and that will inform how we think about the future and enable us to be a better futures thinker.
And at the end of the chapter, we actually use the example of the invasion of Iraq at the beginning of the century, where both the CIA and MI6 were saying that Saddam Hussein had weapons of destruction. And they hadn't actually really questioned the basic evidence for that. They just wanted to please George Bush and Tony Blair. And they should have gone through a whole Socratic process on each layer of intelligence to see whether it could add up to the assertion that he had weapons of mass destruction. And it was subsequently shown that there was no evidence at all. And it's just one of those traps we fall into, that we kind of make assumptions about the future that suit us rather than using the Socratic method. So that's why it's such an important chapter in the book.
So the next chapter, if you haven't guessed already, is also about ancient Greek philosophers. So one of the passions that Clem and I share in terms of our background is we both studied philosophy in our undergrads. And so we're passionate philosophers at heart. And we think that ultimately that is the core of a good futures thinker and someone who's, you know, most effective at thinking about the future, because a philosopher is aware in that Socratic wisdom, aware of the limits of their knowledge, and therefore doesn't have that foolhardy belief in how the future will play out. So the next chapter, chapter 3, we talk about the Stoics. And there's another brilliant story at the heart of Stoicism from this ancient Greek merchant called Zeno of Citium, who was on his way from Piraeus, or from Phoenicia to Piraeus on a ship when a really big storm hit him, and ended up damaging his ship completely and losing all of his cargo. And on his cargo was incredibly valuable purple dye that they used to dye the togas of the royalty and the aristocracy in those times. And in that storm, he got taken onto the island. He lost everything, and he went into a bookshop as he was walking around ancient Athens in a decrepit state, and stumbled into a bookshop and read a book that was written by one of Socrates' students. And he then said he was so bowled over by the brilliance of this book that this man, who now had absolutely nothing, who previously was very wealthy, went around trying to identify Socrates and all of Socratic thinking to try and build a philosophy of his own. And he started a philosophy where he would engage with a number of his colleagues on the Stoa Poikile, which is this porch in ancient Athens. And because of their frequency of debating and discussing life's brilliance and tragedies on that porch, they got the name the Stoics. And what the Stoics were very famous for was, as in all ancient Greek philosophy, trying to understand how we can live happy and fulfilling lives. And they said so much of our unhappiness and our angst and our anxiety that we have is shaped by how our emotions are tied to our external reality. Like dependent variables in statistics or mathematics, we get influenced by the external world, and that shapes our emotions, that shapes our beliefs about the world. Rather, he said, and the Stoics thought, that there's so much to the external world that is beyond our control. Almost everything. If you think of politics, economics, what people think and say about you, the latest social trends, fashion, all of these things are beyond your control. Instead of being consumed by them, instead of relating directly your happiness to these external events, how can you put up a bit of a barricade and understand that your beliefs of the world, how you think about it, is within your control, and create that distinction between what is outside of your control and what is within your control. And this is an incredibly powerful principle for those that are making decisions about their lives, especially in relation to how the future may play out. So much, if not all of the future, is outside of your control. You then need to relate back to your decision-making capability to say, what is within my control? And how can I influence those factors such that I'm prepared and to thrive or survive no matter what scenario materializes? And so Stoicism, another ancient Greek philosophy, underpins a core principle to thinking about the future more effectively.
That leads to the fourth chapter of the book, which is really the crunch chapter on the methodology that we recommend. And the giant in this chapter is Pierre Wack, a Frenchman who was one of the best scenario planners of all time during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. He learned from an American called Herman Kahn, who adopted the phrase scenario planning in 1960 when he wrote a book called On Thermonuclear War, Thinking the Unthinkable, and posed a scenario of a major conflict between Russia and America. And interestingly, 2 years later, the two countries very nearly came to blows over the missile crisis in Cuba. And apparently the Americans had read this book and realized that, that it would mean worldwide destruction. And Kennedy and Khrushchev actually got together and avoided a nuclear conflict. So that's the good thing about scenarios. It's not about what actually happens. It's sometimes about stopping something happening. And I'll be referring to that a little bit later on in terms of climate change. So Pierre then became head of scenario planning at Royal Dutch Shell in London during the 1970s and did some incredible work, which came to the attention of my company, Anglo American. And we thought we would invite him to Johannesburg to give a lecture on scenario planning to our executive committee. And I was the secretary at the time. And he bewitched everybody. And the chairman, Gavin Relly, turned to me and said, would you like to take on the role of scenario planning in addition to your mining responsibilities? And Pierre can work for us as a consultant. And I had this magical period of about 12 years working with one of the greatest minds in the world. And we did the scenarios in the mid-80s, the high road of this country actually getting together, negotiating its future, reaching a settlement and becoming a democracy, and the low road of confrontation leading to civil war and a wasteland. And as you know, with the release of Mandela, we took the high road. But Pierre had a very rigid technique for scenario planning. He said, the first thing you must do is look at the rules of the game, those things which apply to all scenarios. So we do have this example of climate change. One of the rules of the game that we all know came out of COP26 in Glasgow is that nations have to cooperate with one another. If they don't cooperate with one another, then unfortunately there cannot be a good scenario. And another very important rule of the game for climate change is that technology is shared with rich nations and poor nations, just like the vaccines are being shared during this pandemic. Technology, green technology has to be shared, and the money has to be shared if everybody is going to come to the party on climate change. So the first thing you do when you're looking at the future using scenario planning is identify the rules of the game which are relevant for what you're considering. The second thing is you look at the key uncertainties, the driving forces which can drive the future in one direction or another within the rules of the game. And of course, with climate change, the most important uncertainty right now is the relationship between China and America, because they are completely different in culture. I mean, I've done lectures at Harvard Business School on scenario planning, but also at the Central Party School in Beijing, which is the leadership academy of the Chinese Communist Party. And I can tell you that their culture is completely different. You know, one is quite individualistic, American, and the other is pretty collectivist, which is Chinese. And so it remains uncertain whether these two nations can unite sufficiently in order to create a positive climate change scenario. So that's the second step, key uncertainties. The third step is writing the scenarios themselves. And as we say in the book, they should be like movie scripts so that you really motivate people on the upside scenarios and obviously try to get them to avoid the downside scenarios. I mean, in climate change, if you say, well, the chances that we will go beyond 1.5 degrees are now 66.6%, that doesn't motivate people. But if you offer them different scenarios of the future of the world, it really does. And we have 4 scenarios in the book. The first one is the positive one, where you do get the kind of unity of approach. You also have a commitment by nations to create green economies, and they're prepared to accept measurable outcomes in doing that. And we call that paradise regained, because we've seen a real slippage in our world over the last 10 to 15 years in terms of extreme weather patterns. I mean, right now, Vancouver is going through absolute hell because it had 50-degree centigrade temperatures in July, and now it is overwhelmed with flooding in British Columbia. And so you want to regain the kind of stability in our climate, and that's paradise regained. If, however, it's all as Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish teenager, said about COP26, it's all blah, blah, blah. In other words, it's just green apathy. Then it's the other Milton poem, Paradise Lost. But even worse than that is if the world starts really falling apart. And you have a scenario which we call pandemonium, where you have billions of refugees, I mean, not millions, billions of refugees moving from uninhabitable parts of this planet to those parts that are habitable. So, I mean, the world economy just literally disappears. And so there is an incredibly bad scenario that has to be avoided, because most climate change scientists will say that a rule of the game is that everything is happening now, whereas 20 years ago they were predicting that would happen towards the end of the century. The last scenario we have is called isolated Edens, where a few brave countries like Scandinavian countries try and maintain some kind of green integrity in their environments, but it doesn't work in the long run because we all share the same atmosphere. And so, you know, we hope that these scenarios create the kind of conversation that is required. And we follow that with a chapter on the flags that should go with the scenarios, because it's very important that in working out the probability of that scenario as the future unfolds, you look for the green flags and the red flags. So obviously a green flag will be if the results of COP26 next year are converted into measurable outcomes, and then countries are held accountable for that. Then you're looking towards a kind of paradise regained scenario. But if indeed it's just another rhetorical session, then it's blah, 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 and we're in the paradise lost, moving towards pandemonium. So you've got to look at those flags. It's not to give an exact probability to a scenario, it's to just weigh up whether the odds are improving on the good scenario or not. So we used an Austrian philosopher called Karl Popper for this chapter, because he talked of clocks and clouds. Clocks are pretty predictable mechanisms. Clouds change their shape during the day. So you have this kind of continuum between certainty and uncertainty. And what our flags do is give you an idea of what the probability of the scenario is along that continuum.
So after looking at flags, we then dive into a Scottish philosopher from the Enlightenment period called David Hume. And he identified something that is probably the number one reason why you make poor decisions, and the number one reason that holds you back as a futurist thinker. And that was, he was looking at the role of our emotions. He's very famous for saying that you probably have heard of, but probably only heard a snippet of, where he says, reason is the slave of passion. But if you expand that quote to see what he actually said, he says, reason is the slave of passion, and it cannot pretend to any other office but to serve and obey it. And so not only does this absolute legend of rational thinking think that our reason and our rationality is subject and inferior to our emotions, but he says that that's how it ought to be. And the reason why he says that is because even though reason makes sense, it is motivationally inert, meaning we get our motivation to do things through our emotions, through our passions. And to understand this, we really have to understand robots, believe it or not. And the word robot actually comes from a Czech word, robota, which means forced labor. In other words, a slave. And if you think about how we engage with the so-called robots of our modern day world, whether it be the devices we're watching this on, or our phones, or any other kind of robot device, is that it is our slave. It is the slave to whatever our passions are. If we want to make a cup of tea, if we want to look on the internet, if we want to watch a webinar, the device, the internet, that must do what we say it should do. And understanding that role of reason and passion is critically important. Robots, by their very nature, don't have passions. They don't have emotions. They don't really have a reason to get up in the morning, unlike humans. So humans, in terms of our engagement with each other and our engagement with the world, is shaped by our passions that we have for things in terms of what we value. And thinking the future in and of itself doesn't have value. It only has value because of its relation or its relevance to that which we do hold dear, whether it be where or when we should send our kids to school, where or when we should buy a house, where or when we should move to, or what kind of career we should have. All of these decisions, even though they go through a logical process of reasoning and rationality, have the origins of their motivation in a passion we have, in a kind of what this British philosopher Julian Baggini calls a moral sympathy, an understanding of how important other humans are, how we shape politics and our nation state, and how we are kind and loving and caring to other people doesn't come from only our ability to reason that way, but from an inner kind of passion and emotion we have for that purpose. And so he was very clear on trying to create this distinction and an understanding of the importance of seeing the role of passions and our emotions in terms of being the motivation we have to do things, but then the role of reason and rationality to shape those passions. Because if those passions are unleashed, if they don't have a rein on them, then they will do all sorts of things. We will go back to the Stoics, be consumed by an anger or frustration we have, rather than shape that towards a logical end that we desire. And so understanding the importance of the role of reason and passion and the interplay between these two forces that are two inner forces that all humans share will enable us to more effectively think about our future going forward, understanding their scope, their role in terms of how we make decisions.
Yeah, and if I can give you a very good example, I did a debate in February 2016 with Julius Malema at the Cape Sun, and it was called Rumble in the Urban Jungle. And I said to Julius, who was a brilliant debating partner, I must say, I said, I believe as passionately in economic freedom as you do, Julius. It's just that my definition of economic freedom is different to yours. You want to take over the banks and the mines and the land, and that's your really big issue. Mine is to create a level of economic freedom in our country, which will lead to a whole new generation of entrepreneurs. And that is the only way we're going to bring down our hideous unemployment rate, is to create this people's economy, an inclusive economy. And you've got to have a passion about it. That's why scenario planning is just so much better than trying to forecast the future, because obviously you can give a probability to a good and a bad future in South Africa, but that's not going to make people change their behavior. It's only by really getting into their emotional side that people are going to get together at community level and do what they did after that terrible period of looting a couple of months ago. Actually put those communities back together again, clean up, and obviously protect all the undamaged property. It was South Africa at its worst, and then South Africa at its best. And the way you get people to do things is, as Mitch said, is by triggering their passion. Which brings me to the next chapter in the book, which is on a real giant called Charles Darwin. And we chose it because he had a famous expression called survival of the fittest. And people think that's survival of the strongest, but it's not. It's survival of the species that fit in most with the changes in nature around them. So going back to Stoic philosophy, it's the adaptation of your own genes to that world of nature which is beyond your control. That is the critical thing for survival. And the chapter, in fact, we call Adaptation and Innovation, because the one other great quality we have is innovation. I mean, think about this pandemic where we were 2 years ago when we didn't have a vaccine. And most people said that a vaccine could be even 5, 10 years away. But there were these brilliant minds around the world, very, very different people who came up with a suitable vaccine within 1 year and managed to get it on the market. There was this German couple of Turkish origin who really led the whole race and created the Pfizer vaccine. Absolutely brilliant. So we just feel that being a fox is not just about adapting to the future, but it's also about creating something completely new and different, and thinking about that as well.
So before I kick on to the next chapter, I want to just implore you to ask some questions. You have the capability in the question and answer function to pose a question. It'll come directly to Clem and I, and we'll answer that for you. We're going to spend about another 10-15 minutes going through the remaining chapters, and then we'd love to answer some questions. So hopefully you can send a few of those through. So the next chapter we touch on is one of Clem and my favorite chapters, because it's looking at the ethical dimension to futures thinking. And this has always been important, but is becoming ever more important as we look to the future. If you think of the prominence of things like ESG and investing circles now, in terms of what Clem mentioned around Greta Thunberg and climate change, you know, the sustainability of humans generally relies on how ethical we are and the ethical nature of our decision making going forward. And chapter 8 has 3 brilliant thinkers in it: Hannah Arendt, Philippa Foot, and Dame Veronica Wedgwood. But I'm just going to give you a snapshot of Hannah Arendt and one of the very interesting dimensions to her thinking. She divided our experience, our existence, into 3 categories. She said, we have labor, we have work, and we have action. Labor as a category is the very basic necessities of life: how we put shelter over our heads, us eating, and yes, going to the toilet as well. It's the basic necessities that we need in order to survive. Then we have the work category, where this is our ability to mold our existence, to create things like tables and computers and the internet, and to make our existence on this planet a little bit more convenient for us. We work on the world and we mold it to how we envisage it. And then finally, we have the action category. And this is really what defines us as human beings and what separates us from animals, because it is all about our freedom and expressing our freedom. And this is what makes us political animals, why we group together into communities, into nation states, into regions. It's the very reason that makes us get up in the morning and want to engage with other people in a kind of social way. And this freedom, she says, is very, very important from a political perspective. But there are 2 future-related dimensions that are shaped by our freedom that are potentially devastating for us. And she called it the irreversibility of our actions and the unpredictability of our actions. So our actions, by their very nature, because of this freedom, our ability to shape our world and engage with us and each other however we see fit, is by its nature unpredictable. You can't predict what we're going to do or how we're going to do it. And this is incredibly problematic for a number of reasons. And we see this on a daily basis in terms of the trials and tribulations of how we engage in conversation with each other. But the other problem she highlighted was the irreversibility of our actions. We live in this web of social interactions, and each action we undertake has a consequence to it, which has a following consequence to it. And so our actions, by their very nature, are irreversible. But she says there are 2 ways in which we can address unpredictability and irreversibility of our actions. And again, they're future-related dimensions that are critically important for you to think about when thinking the future. To address the unpredictability, we have the ability to promise, she says. Now, promising, even though you're all familiar with it, is a very important facet to how we engage with each other, because it sets the scope for our actions. Whereas they're previously unpredictable, promising shapes the scope. So if we say we're going to fetch our child from school at 2 p.m., then we're promising to them that that is where we'll be at 2 p.m. and not doing something else. We set a scope, a perimeter for our actions. And so promising is the antidote to the unpredictability of our actions. But then she says, okay, what about irreversibility? What about the irreversibility of our actions, having this chain of reactions, these consequences that go beyond our control? Well, she says we can stop that irreversibility through forgiveness. And this was something that Nelson Mandela was brilliant at, in terms of understanding that every action will have an infinite chain unless we are able to forgive, to kind of cut the chain and to say, okay, I forgive you for the action, and therefore we can move beyond. And Nelson Mandela did this at the end of apartheid. You know, after 20 odd years of harboring what must have been a lot of resentment and anger and frustration at a terrible apartheid regime, instead of then bringing that to the fore and trying to get retribution for that, said, okay, we need to go through a process of forgiveness and reconciliation, because otherwise, you know, the new dawn of South Africa will be shaped by our past and not by our future. So he understood that actions are not irreversible if we have this power of forgiveness. And that those are two critically important ethical dimensions to our futures thinking, being able to promise and stick to those promises, but then also having the power of forgiveness to stop that irreversibility of our actions.
Which is a very good preamble to the second last chapter on thinking and doing, because you're not remembered for just thinking. You're remembered if you do after you've processed your thoughts. And we have two giants in this chapter. The first is Nelson Mandela, who I actually met in prison for a 5-hour question and answer session at the beginning of 1990, January, because he'd read about the high road, low road, and he wanted to look at the future and see how he could influence it himself. He didn't tell me he was going to be released, but he questioned me like a lawyer about the assumptions behind our scenarios. And then, as Mitch quite rightly said, he came out and he did it. And when things started falling apart in the negotiations, he and the late F.W. de Klerk would get together and make sure they got back on track. And it did deliver a new South Africa. And the other giant we have in the chapter is Steve Jobs, because he loved beauty, but that's not what we remember him for. It's all those incredible devices that Apple has made. He had two careers at Apple. He had one in the 80s where the Apple and the Mac were created, but then he had a row with the CEO at the time and left and went to Pixar and Next. And then he came back to Apple a second time. And this is what he said. He said, the heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure of everything. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. And he produced the iPod, the iPad, the iPhone, all the things that are used by us around the world today. And he said, you've got to be a thinker-doer. That was the way he described it. And so, yeah, we don't want to lose that aspect of thinking the future, that it's there because you must act afterwards.
And then finally, in terms of the last chapter, originally Clem and I started the process by summing up all of the previous chapters. And then we thought, no, that's not good enough. If we're going to be people that are thinking about the future, we need to put a face to this. And we need to actually talk about what is our future. And that is young people. And it's something that both Clem and I are very passionate about in terms of education. And education is very much the mechanism that is shaping our future, more so than any other domain of society. So in this final chapter, we developed some scenarios for the future of education, and we labeled this or titled this chapter Planting Seeds, because it's very much about planting seeds for the future and understanding how it's going to play out by investing in that very resource that is the future. Here we brought in some of the work that I've done through the company that I started called Growing Foxes, where we work with schools and organizations around the world, helping them develop their futures thinking capability, enable young people to think about what they want to do after school. But that question of what they want to do after school depends on the education that they get and the quality of the education they get. So we thought at Growing Foxes, hold on, we need to engage with all of the members, all of the key stakeholders in education to see, well, what does education look like in 10 years' time? What will education look like in 2030? So we convened a massive roundtable, getting principals, teachers, pupils, ministers of education, business leaders. We've got 140 participants from 6 different countries: the United Kingdom, Australia, Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia, and asked them this question: what do you think the future of education will look like in 10 years' time? And we worked through the methodology that Clem highlighted and that's detailed in chapter 4 of this book in terms of how you build scenarios. We looked at what are the rules of the game. We then distinguished those from the key uncertainties and then isolated 2 key uncertainties that would be fundamental to shaping future scenarios for education. And the participants identified 2 key uncertainties that would shape these scenarios. One, they said the relevance of education. How relevant is education in preparing young people for this changing world that we're going to be entering into, this changing world of work that they're going to be entering into? Understanding that someone starting school today, is going to be working in a world in 2050. And so what does the world look like in 2050? And are we preparing them for that world, not today's world? So the relevance of education, how relevant is it? And then secondly was the culture of openness to change amongst educators. Ultimately, you're not going to have a more relevant education model unless educators themselves are open to change, or whether they are resistant to change and therefore try and embed this legacy model that we've inherited that has been, shaped education over the last 100 years or so. So using those 2 key uncertainties, they developed 4 scenarios, and I want to just take you through a few of them. In the top right-hand corner, the best case scenario, where we have a highly relevant education system characterized by an openness to change. They played on the Jim Collins book and called it a bad to great scenario. And this is where education is highly relevant, it's technologically enabled, and teachers and educators are constantly revising the curriculum and the modes of teaching to enable that relevance. That is a bad to great scenario. Top right-hand corner, best case scenario. On the top left-hand quadrant, where it is a highly relevant education, but characterized by a culture of resistance to change, they labeled it 1 step forward, 2 step back. And here, every inch of innovation is fought for. Every time educators move forward, they're pushed back by other principals or teachers or ministers of education that are resistant to that change. And so the relevance of education has a limit to it. Conversely, on the bottom right-hand corner, we have a scenario called up the wrong tree. And this is where education is barking up the wrong tree, even though educators themselves are the ones most keen to and most open to change and wanting to revolutionize the system. They're doing it in a very ad hoc way where they're tacking on innovations that perhaps aren't relevant. And you might know about it when you read newspaper headlines saying that a school that doesn't have toilets is trying to implement a coding or robotics program. They tack on innovations without fundamentally re-understanding or reinterpreting education as a whole. So that's where education is barking up the wrong tree, characterized by openness to change, but it's an irrelevant education system. And then finally, and this is where the participants had a bit of fun in terms of naming the scenario, they called the scenario where it's a culture of resistance to change and an irrelevant education model, a plucked ostrich scenario. That's for 2 reasons. One, because of what plucked ostrich sounds like, but then also because ostriches themselves put their heads in the sand when they are confronted with change or danger. And this, the participants identified was the scenario that they believe we are currently in now. an irrelevant education system characterized by our resistance to change. And I think everyone has a stake in this game. It doesn't matter if you have a kid in school or not, if you are a business leader or not. Everyone in society has a stake or a relation to the future of education. If the future of education is promising, as bright, is in that bad to great scenario, the butterfly effect for every inch of our society will be positive. Conversely, if it remains as it is, stuck in the past, stuck in a legacy model, in a plucked ostrich scenario, then, you know, there's only so much that we as a society can advance technologically, economically, politically, socially, and culturally. And so Clem and I wanted to end the book on this chapter because we very much believe that young people are the future. And so what better way to end the book?
I'd like to just finish with the last two paragraphs of the book, which goes back to the Spartans. It reads like this: flush with victory after invading a number of city-states in southern Greece, King Philip of Macedon, father of the famous Alexander the Great, turned his attention to the powerful Sparta. He besieged the city and, confident of the outcome, sent an unambiguous threat to its leaders. If I defeat you, we will raze your city to the ground. We will kill every man and boy in the city and take every woman and girl into slavery. The Spartans sent a one-word reply: if. And that is what this book is about. It shows that there's uncertainty in the future. It shows that you've got to play different possibilities for the future, not rely on a single forecast. And then it shows massively that you've got to convert those thoughts into action, which improve the probability of the good scenario and lower the odds of the bad scenario. And I'd like to end this presentation before we take questions with a quote we have in the first chapter: "May the fox be with you." Thank you very much.
So thank you, everyone. I'm going to give a couple minutes just for you to type your questions into the question and answer section if you have any. At the moment, I don't see any, and I'm assuming that's because Clem and I were so captivating that you didn't have a moment to spare to write your questions. But now that we've finished, hopefully you can write in a couple there, and we'll be very happy to answer them over the next 8 minutes or so. If not, and if none come through, then, you know, you can get to your gin and tonic even sooner than initially planned. But, you know, maybe we'll give 30 seconds or so if someone wants to put forward a question in the question answer section. You just scroll down to the bottom to Q&A and you put the question there. That'll come directly through to Clem and I, and we'd be very happy to answer any of those questions.
And whilst you're formulating a question, just one point we make on a flag between the two scenarios we quote in the book for the future of South Africa. One is called People's Economy, which I've described, and the other is called Cautionary Tale, where we slide into increasing anarchy become a failed state. And, you know, obviously people were very worried with that rioting, that was the first flag in favor of the failed state scenario, Cautionary Tale. But of course, the pushback was such that we feel that the odds came back into line on the People's Economy. But one important flag we mentioned in the book is that Cyril Ramaphosa now should establish an entrepreneurial panel, just like he's got a panel of medical experts to see the way through the epidemic, the pandemic. We need a panel of people who've actually started businesses and put it together. People like Adrian Gore of Discovery, maybe even Elon Musk, who's now the richest man in the world from Pretoria Boys High. I mean, very few schools can say they had the richest man in the world and the winner of the Booker Prize in the same decade at the same school, but Pretoria Boys High did. And we need that kind of flag that Cyril holds us accountable for creating this people's economy and sets objectives on television, just like he's done with the pandemic, that would be the biggest green flag of all.
So here's a question for you, Clem, and I think this is a very interesting one. Given those scenarios that you touched on earlier around in the one chapter of the book, around the future of climate change, in terms of paradise lost, paradise regained, isolated Edens, and green apathy. After looking at COP26, what do you think in terms of the balance of probabilities? Which scenario do you think we're heading towards, or is most likely in the coming decade?
I have to say that it's the blah, 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 Greta Thunberg paradise lost scenario. I'm afraid to say that if there was just a lot of pledges made, but there were no concrete goals which people are held accountable to, or nations. And you know, if that nation doesn't reach those goals, then action is taken against that nation. It's the only way you get things done in this world, is to hold people accountable. And that did not come out of COP26. So COP27, which is next year in Egypt, I believe, I really hope those measurable targets are set, because if we don't move beyond the world of rhetoric, then I'm afraid to say that we're in the paradise lost, possibly pandemonium side of the matrix, rather than having the paradise regained scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. So another question, does our education system teach these underlying principles of good futures thinking? And I would say, in terms of our experience, it would be a no, with the proviso that there are some brilliant schools in South Africa, in terms of some pockets of excellence that definitely are world-beating schools and are incredibly innovative. But sadly, they're pockets of excellence and they're not a widespread reality in South Africa. We work from a Growing Foxes perspective closely with the Western Cape Education Department, where we're trying to bring in these skills of thinking more effectively about the future, because it is ultimately an incredibly important life skill for young people. And hopefully that'll be a launching pad for making this more of a widespread reality. But until that time comes, I think there is a resistance to change in terms of these scenarios that we look at in the book. There's a resistance to change amongst educators from, you know, the teacher level all the way to the principal level, and ultimately to the Minister of Education level. And until we start seeing evolution there, then the rest will struggle to follow. But, you know, we are seeing, you know, as they are resistant to change, we are seeing new non-traditional players or alternative education offerings come to the fore. And ultimately, they might take out the traditional school model altogether. And so schools will have to evolve and will have to adapt if they want to survive into the next decade, let alone in this one.
And you know, Mitch, am I right that St. John's College in Johannesburg is one of the schools which has wholeheartedly adopted the Growing Foxes program?
Absolutely right. And there's schools dotted throughout South Africa and in Australia as well, and in Zimbabwe. And so there's definitely schools that are making this progress, but St. John's has definitely been a leader in that regard. And I've recently done the strategy for St. Albans College in Pretoria, and they too are incredibly innovative. So it's about understanding what the right model is, getting the right people to the table, and understanding that substantial revolutionary change is required, not inch by inch progress. A complete rethink needs to be done, and even though that's daunting, it's critical. And so that critical aspect needs to overcome. So I see we've got 1 minute left, so I'm going to hand over to you, Viz, just to wrap things up.
Well, I hope that you've found this interesting. For me, it's been a very long journey, because the very first book that I helped write was in the 1960s with a master at my school, Winchester College, called Eric Emmett. And it was called Learning to Philosophize. And that's where my passion for philosophy started, was helping him with one of my colleagues in my class to help him write this book, which was published by Pelican and was a huge hit in the UK for Pelican. Which was a brand of penguin. in the 1960s. And one of the things that we did in that book was ask questions at the end of each chapter to get people to think actively about what we're saying. And if you read this book, exactly the same applies. We actually ask you questions at the end of each chapter. And I'd just like to read you what we said at the end of the chapter on Pierre Wack. We said, what does your microcosm or mental model of the world around you look like? Is your microcosm so strongly held that it inhibits you from reperceiving the world by considering scenarios incompatible with your microcosm picture of the world? And then we say, try imagining different scenarios of where you will be in 10 years' time. Start by figuring out the rules of the game that are common to all your futures and give particular attention to the rules of winning or succeeding at the game. Next, make a short list of key uncertainties that could change your life and select 2 crucial uncertainties that are likely to shape your future, depending on whether they have positive or negative outcomes. Plot these 2 uncertainties as a pair of intersecting axes, as we have demonstrated. Describe personal scenarios for each of the 4 quadrants and give them gripping titles. What do they look like, and what are you going to do about the opportunities and threats they offer? So that's why we wrote this book. It wasn't for, all the academics, the big companies, governments, and so forth and so on. We wrote it so that you as an individual can start thinking more effectively about the future and then take action.
Wow, thank you so much, Clem, Sunter, and Mitch. Ilbury, we're very lucky to have you guys. And this is probably one of my favorite books of this year, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for the book. Once again, thanks a lot to Cerise Smith from Exclusive Books who helped put this together. We thank you very much on behalf of the publisher and the authors. And also to Exclusive Books, if you don't have a copy of the book, please get your copy at any Exclusive Bookstore or the online space, the online store. It's widely available. Get yourself a copy, get a copy for someone you love. It's a very important title and we should be reading this. So thank you very much for joining us this evening and have a good one.